Today's parashah takes us on a deeper journey into the three parts of the narrative, the treaty narrative. As we considered last Shabbat, the book is broken down into parts, a set of portions that match in many ways the format of the ancient Near Eastern treaty of that period. Now, having arrived on the plains of Moab after 38 years of wandering through the wilderness, that second generation were being prepared to enter the land of promise. But like their fathers before them, they were still holding Yahweh in contempt. Therefore, Yahweh was silent towards his people, and he allowed Moshe to instruct them on what was required in the future. So having laid out the treaty preamble in the previous parashah, Moshe now moves on to consider the historical review and the specific stipulations and also the general stipulations. As with the other books of Moshe, Devarim does not follow the chronological pattern, but rather it's in a mix of assorted discourses that often been brought together in what could be considered a random pattern. Hence we'll move through the book over the next few weeks, and I will jump about in various parts of each parashah, looking at various portions of each chapter. So today I want to jump over the latter part of chapter 3 and consider that at a later date when we consider the death of Moshe. The reason for jumping over that portion is because it's inserted there as part of what Yahweh is doing with Moshe himself leading up to Moshe's death. But it's not really part of the narrative of the treaty. It's a subject that is something separate, so we'll deal with that when he dies. Instead, let's dive into the historical review, where Moshe considers many of the events that actually took place between Israel leaving Egypt and the time they arrived at the plains of Moab. Now, the historical review starts in chapter 4 and reviews some of the key features that their fathers encountered from Yahweh when they were at Mount Horev. Starting in verse 10, it says, "The day you stood before Yahweh, your God, at Mount Horev, when Yahweh said to me, 'Gather the people to me, and I will make them hear every word, so that they will learn to hold me in awe as long as they live on the earth, so that they will teach their children.'" Now Moshe is now speaking to that second generation, as if they had actually personally been at Mount Horev. He explains how the mountain was blazing with fire in the midst of darkness and thick cloud, and then they heard the voice of Yahweh speaking to all Israel in the midst of the fire. They heard the voice of Yahweh, but they saw no shape. That is how Yahweh gave Israel the 10 words that were to be the marriage covenant between himself and his people Israel, which of course Moshe later received as 2 tablets of stone. However, they were so overwhelmed by the sight and sound that they pleaded with Moshe that Yahweh should no longer speak directly with them. They feared that they would die if he spoke. So they wanted Moshe to listen to Yahweh, and then he was to tell them all that Yahweh had to say. After Yahweh told Moshe to dismiss the people, dismiss the assembly, Moshe stayed up in the presence of Yahweh for a further 40 days and received all the mitzvot, the laws and the rulings. That was after he'd received the 10 words. While Moshe was still on the mountain, of course, they built the golden calf. So he reiterated and expanded on what Yahweh had said in the first 2 commandments. He reminds the second generation that Yahweh had brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery, And no other generation had had that experience. And the second command was that they were never to make any carved images of anything at that time or in the future. So these were urgent times, because Moshe realized that the second generation were just as errant as their fathers had been. But it was only a matter of days before they would actually be crossing the Yarden River. So he tried again to convince them that they must learn from the mistakes their fathers had made, and how important it was to recognize the depth of the blessings that they had received. So he says in chapter 4, verses 32 and 33, "Indeed, since the day God created human beings on earth, has there ever been anything as wonderful as this? Has anyone heard anything like it? Did any other people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of fire, as you have heard, and you stayed alive?" And Moshe continues, reminding them that just how privileged they were among all of humanity. And in the midst of what he was saying, he reiterates again in verse 40, "You are to keep his laws and mitzvot, which I am giving you today, so that you will all go well with you and your children after you, so that you will prolong your days in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you forever." Now Moshe concludes his review of the events that occurred at Mount Horev, and then moves on to consider the mitzvot and the rulings. Now these are where we come to the specific stipulations. As the treaty narrative of Devarim moves into the area of specific stipulations, Moshe is telling the second generation to observe, first of all, the 10 words, and then the mitzvot. But it must be remembered that even though those 10 words had been given by Moshe on 2 tablets of stone, that second generation never saw those stones. Moshe broke the first tablets at the time of the golden calf incident, and the second set that he received, he put straight into the Ark of the Covenant. They never were seen again. From that time forward, no one has ever laid eyes on those tablets of stone, and it is most likely they will never appear again until the time when Yeshua reigns. Because that second generation did not see those tablets, Moshe had to tell them the whole message all over again of what happened at the top of Mount Horev. So he assembled all the people, and in chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, he says, "Listen, Israel, to the laws and rulings which I am announcing in your hearing today, so that you will learn to take care and obey them. Yahweh our God made a covenant with us at Horev. Yahweh did not make his covenant with our fathers, but with us. With us, all of you who are here alive today." Now, because that first generation had all died in the wilderness, Moshe's telling that second generation that they are the ones who will be responsible for passing on the words of Yahweh to the next generation and beyond. Chapter 5, in verses 6 through 18, is a complete rerun of the 10 words which Yahweh gave to that previous generation. But because the tablets were locked away in the ark, and having spoken those words to that second generation, Moshe then wrote them down on a scroll, which he laid alongside the ark. He did that so that each future generation would hear the words on a regular basis. Moshe reminded them of the importance in not only the 10 words, but also the rest of the laws and rulings. As he says in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, "Now, Israel, listen to the laws and rulings that I am teaching you, in order to follow them, so that you will live, and then you will take possession of the land that Yahweh your God is giving you. I order you to obey the mitzvot your God is giving you, so that you will not add to or subtract anything from it. The 10 words, along with the rest of the mitzvot and rulings, Yahweh formed as part of the specific stipulations of this covenant or treaty. It was a treaty between the king and his subjects. So at that stage, Moshe was actually aware of the need for Israel to hear and observe all that Yahweh had given him. So he keeps repeating his warning to them that they need to apply all these mitzvot and rulings that Yahweh has given them over their own lives, and they would also be responsible for the passing on of this message to the next generation. That is why he gets so passionate in saying in chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, now this is the mitzvot, law and rulings, which Yahweh your God ordered you to teach for you to obey in the land we are crossing to take possession, so that you will fear Yahweh your God and observe all his regulations and mitzvot that I am giving you, your children, and your grandchildren, as long as you live, so that you will have a long life. Therefore, listen, Israel, take care to obey, so that all the things will go well with you, so that you will increase greatly, as Yahweh your God, the God of your ancestors, has promised you by giving you the land flowing with milk and honey. So having done his very best to instill the message into the minds of that second generation, he concludes his discourse by setting before them what has become known to us, or through the Jewish world, to be the most important of all the mitzvot. Moshe is giving them the Shema. In chapter 6, verse 4, Shema Isra'el, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh, our God, Yahweh is one. Then he continues on in verses 5 through 9, where he gives them what has become known, of course, as the V'ahavta, meaning you shall love. So important are these words that even Yeshua said those verses were the most important mitzvah. As we read in Matthew chapter 22, verses 33 to 40. When the crowd heard how he taught, they were astounded. But when the Perishim learned that he had silenced the Zedukim, they got together, and one of them, who was a Torah expert, asked the Shelah to trap him. Rabbi, which of the mitzvot of Torah is the most important? He told them, you are to love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This is the greatest of them and the most important mitzvah. And the second is similar to it. You are to love Yahweh your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the rest of the Torah and the prophets is dependent on these two mitzvot. That brings us to the end of the specific stipulations. Now we can move to the general stipulations, which determine how the specific ones were to be applied in everyday life. Moshe goes on in speaking to the second generation, where he's telling them that he's fully aware that they would be entering the land of promise, and he realized how important it was for them to appreciate their relationship with Yahweh. After all, they were the generation that was going to conquer the land and displace all the nations that were living there. That task was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. They were going to face established enemy forces, just like their fathers had faced when they brought back the 10 bad reports. That is, unless they listen intently to the promises Yahweh had made, firstly to Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and the same promises which he reiterated to that first generation when they stood at the foot of Mount Horev. When the 12 spies reconnoitred the land, they failed to heed those promises. They saw the people in the land as being an insurmountable obstacle because they failed to acknowledge the promise that Yahweh had made, that he would go ahead of them and displace those nations. Yahweh promised that he would drive the nations before them, before Israel, Israel progressively moved through the promised territory. That second generation had to grasp the depth and significance of what Moshe was saying, so that they would appreciate that Yahweh was going to proceed ahead of them as they went through the land. Moshe again reminds them in chapter 4 verses 3 to 9 that they had all witnessed what Yahweh had done for them when they had allowed themselves to be drawn into the Baal Peor incident. As part of that reminder, Moshe contrasts the worthlessness of Baal and the benefits that can be gained by having trust in Yahweh. As he says in verses 7 and 8, what great nation is there that has God close to them as Yahweh, our God, is close? Whenever we call on him, what great nation is there that has laws and rulings just as the entire Torah which he is setting before you today? There is none other like it. So what about the conquest of the land? In chapter 7, Moshe continues with those general stipulations by telling Israel how they are to behave as they progressively conquer the land, saying in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4, Yahweh your God is going to bring you into the land you will enter in order to take possession of it, and he will expel many nations ahead of you, the Hittite, the Gazizi, the Amori, the Canaanite, the Perizzi, the Hivi, and the Yevuzi. 7 nations bigger and stronger than you are. When he does this, when Yahweh your God hands them over ahead of you, and you defeat them, you are to destroy them completely. Do not make any covenant with any of them, and show them no mercy. Now, continuing that promise of support, Moshe next gives them a long discourse when he summarizes all the benefits that they will enjoy when they have conquered the land, providing they observe the mitzvot and rulings that Moshe has laid down before them. So looking at chapter 6, verses 10 through 19, he tells them how they will live in the houses that were vanquished, houses of the vanquished nations. They will drink from the wells already dug by others. They will eat from the vineyards and the olive trees that are left by the others. They will no longer have to depend upon their daily supply of manna from heaven, because Yahweh will enable them to enjoy all the food, shelter, and water they ever need when they come to possess the land. All they have to do is trust and rely that Yahweh, their King and Master, will be with them and go ahead of them. But Moshe finishes that discourse again, reminding them of what will happen if they fail to follow those mitzvot of Yahweh. As he says in chapter 6, verses 14 through 16, you are not to follow other gods, because Yahweh, your God, who is here with you, is a jealous God. If you do, the anger of Yahweh will flare up against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the earth. Do not put Yahweh your God to the test, as your fathers tested him at Massah, the place of testing. Then again in chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, Moshe places even further restrictions on the people by saying in verse 3, don't intermarry with them. Don't give your daughters to his son, and don't take his daughter for your son. As we know from the workings of the book of YHVH, which we read earlier this year, Israel did not drive out the people from within the nation. Moshe probably knew in advance that that would occur when they went into the land. So the admonition in verses 3 through 5 was well founded, because they did actually intermarry. They did go and worship Baal, the Asherah, and they left the altars, the standing stones, the sacred poles, all in place. In spite of what Moshe had instructed, they still left it just as it was and went after Baal. But then Moshe gives them softer words. In chapter 7, verses 6 through 10, Moshe, rather than rebuking the people, shows a softer side of Yahweh. As he says in verse 6, "You are a people set apart as holy for Yahweh your God. Yahweh your God has chosen you from all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his own unique treasure." Even though Yahweh had good reason to be permanently angry with Israel, he still regarded them as a set-apart people. Yahweh continued his relationship with his people, not because they deserved to be his only and unique treasure, because of the covenant that he had made with Avraham. For their adherence to Yahweh is summed up for them in the mitzvot, the laws and the rulings, which will become for them what we now know as a national constitution. The responsibility placed before that second generation was to fulfill the obligations that Moshe had given. And in 6 verse 20 he said, "Someday your children will ask you, what is the meaning of these instructions, laws and rulings which Yahweh your God has laid down for you?" Moshe continues reminding them that Yahweh brought their fathers out of Egypt, saying in verse 23, in order to bring you into the land he'd sworn to our ancestors that he would give us. Then in verse 25, it'll be righteousness for us if we are careful to obey those mitzvot before Yahweh. However, as we know, Israel did not follow the mitzvot of Yahweh and were finally thrown out of the nation. As we read in Ezekiel chapter 36, particularly verse 19, "I scattered them among the nations and dispersed them throughout the countries. I judged them in keeping with their manner of life and their actions." That was the result of that future generation not adhering to what Moshe had told that second generation on the plains of Moab. So in conclusion, this has been a long and diverse walk through the dealings of Moshe with that second generation. We have seen how Yahweh kept silent as Moshe revealed all the things that Yahweh had given at Mount Horev. We also see how he's repeating much of what had been said before, simply because that first generation who died in the wilderness had not passed on the Torah to their children of the second generation. Now I've jumped over and around in chapters 4 through 7 to bring certain closure to the related features of this treaty document. Bring them all together as an evenly flowing narrative, because what Yahweh or Moshe exposed to that second generation was important for them, because it was to be instilled in their minds that they had to follow Yahweh and follow his mitzvot if they were going to inherit and retain ownership of that land. Moshe shows the people before him that they had a heavy burden of responsibility that required them to be grounded in Torah so that they would avoid intermarriage, avoid false worship, and more particularly to pass on that same message to their children and grandchildren. They were also vested with the responsibility to ensure that the Torah was read for the whole assembly. Finally, we see that Yeshua also confirmed through his own words that the Shema was the greatest of the mitzvot, and that everything flows on from those words for the benefit of the whole community. even in today, in the 21st century, we can now also see many parallels between what Moshe was saying to that second generation and what transpired when they went over the river into the land. They did not follow the mitzvot. They did not follow the ways of Yahweh. And as Ezekiel said, they were thrown out. So what is the situation in the modern world? Are they any better than they were at that time? Or are they going to have to wait until Yeshua returns before they can truly come into a relationship with Yahweh that was meant to be in the beginning? Shabbat Shalom.